Good morning, Professor Walt in Boston, and good afternoon, everybody here in Warsaw and elsewhere. Dear Professor Walt, fellow professors, scholars, and students, ladies and gentlemen, over the last few weeks and months, we have been witnessing important, I would say, seminal international developments. Two of them are more important than the others. I have in mind, obviously, COVID-19 Pandemia and American presidential election. And I do strongly believe that there is no one better than Professor Steve Walt to explain us their significance and ramifications. We are enormously happy that Professor Walt agreed to be with us and to today online from Harvard University and to share with us his reflections on the matter, to discuss them with us. Professor Walt is one of the most outstanding and respected international relations scholars in the United States and much beyond. Graduated from Stanford and Berkeley, he then moved to continue his academic career to Princeton, then University of Chicago, and now he has a very distinguished position at the Harvard University John Kennedy School of Governance. He does represent a school of thought known in international relations as defensive realism. World politics, world order, American foreign policy are primary fields of his academic interest. I happen to share with Professor Walt from the very beginning his strong criticism towards American military interventions. And he fully made his point recently in an excellent book, Hell of Good Intentions. The design for today's meeting is that we first listen to Professor Walt, Professor Walt's lecture entitled World Politics in the US and COVID-19 Pandemia. And then we will have you, our audience, will have a chance to ask questions, to make comments on chat. We are many, therefore I will be selecting, sorry for that, I'll be selecting questions and comments in order to help a little bit Professor Walt to refer to them. Again, thank you very much, Professor Stephen Waltem, for having accepted our invitation. And before I give you a floor, I invite our Dean, Professor Daniel Pszastek, to welcome both our distinguished guest speaker and all of you. Daniel, Professor Pszastek, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Professor Roman Kuźniar. I would like to welcome all of you, especially our guest, Stephen Walt, who said before, Professor Kuźniar, the American professor of international affairs at Harvard University, John Fitzgerald Kennedy School of Government, author of many books, and an iconic person for international relations. And it's a pleasure that I can welcome you on our Faculty of Political Science and International Relations, especially in this not easy situation. But your theme, World Politics, US and COVID-19 Pandemia, is strictly connected with the situation. And for us in our faculty, it's most important that we can talk, we can speak, we can discuss about current situation, about contemporary situation. It's important to talk about history, but it's most important talking about the present situation. Our host and our main organizer, leader of this today meeting is Professor Roman Kuźniar. I would like to thank a lot, Professor, for arrange this seminar. Also, I would like to thank the promotion office of our faculty to prepare and make today meeting. And I give both of you the floor. It's not so easy floor, but basically give you the screen of our webinar. Have a best discuss, because discuss made a science. I usually said that. And that discuss made the science. So floor is yours. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, our Dean. Thank you, Daniel. for your warm wishes and the warm address. And now we turn to Professor Stephen Walt directly from Boston, from Harvard University. Please, Stephen, floor is yours for some, as we agreed, 30 minutes or 35 minutes or 40 minutes. So please go ahead.
All right. Thank you very much for those very kind introductions. It's a real pleasure for me to have the opportunity to speak with you today. And I'm sorry I can't be there to speak with you in person. I hope perhaps to have the opportunity to do that once the pandemic is over. So I'm going to put up some slides here, and that should be clear, I hope, to everyone. This is what I'm going to talk about today: the global order after COVID, the one we're heading into, and after President Trump is no longer president. And let me start by sort of outlining what my presentation is going to look like. I'm first going to summarize the main arguments of my talk, and then I'll talk a little bit about what was happening in the world before the pandemic struck. What were these trends? I'll then tell you what I see as the immediate impact of the pandemic. That will be, I think, very familiar to most of you. And then I'll talk about three main results that I think it is likely to produce: a somewhat less open world than we would have had otherwise, a somewhat less free world than we would have had otherwise, and I'll talk about how the United States may be more adversely affected than some other countries. Not all other countries, but some, because we didn't handle the pandemic particularly well. After all of that, I'll then talk about what the future global order will look like, and in particular, how the outcome of the US election is likely to affect America's role in that future world order. So here are my main arguments. First and foremost, COVID-19 is not going to alter the basic nature of world politics. It's not going to transform international relations. We are not going to see a sudden increase in global cooperation as a result of this particular event. Instead, nation states, territorial states, will remain the basic building block of world politics, and those states will continue to compete for power and influence, much as they have done for many decades, if not centuries. I do think, however, the pandemic will accelerate several trends that were already underway before it began. So in a sense, we're going to get to where we were headed, but a little bit faster than we would have otherwise. And in particular, it's going to reinforce what was already underway: a gradual shift in power and wealth toward Asia, and produce a world that is going to be somewhat less open and less free than it would have been otherwise. Now, I think the new Biden administration will try to reverse some of those trends, but I don't think it's going to be able to reverse all of them. And in some, they may not actually even try to do very much. So let me talk a little bit about what was happening before the pandemic began. First and foremost, we were seeing the end of unipolarity. Unipolarity being the situation the United States was in after the Cold War, after the Soviet Union fell apart, where the United States was effectively unchallenged in the world, had no serious rivals. And that condition lasted for perhaps 15 or 20 years, but we've seen several trends now undercut that. We're seeing the reemergence of great power competition. The most obvious development, of course, is China's continued rise. It's not as powerful as the United States is yet, but it's clearly a much more formidable rival than it was 20 or 30 years ago. We've also seen the partial recovery of Russian power, not anywhere near as strong as either the United States or China, but not as weak as it was in the 1990s. And all of that has produced a return to great power competition. We are also seeing a gradual shift in power and wealth from west to east. And I don't want to exaggerate this. I am not saying that China is more powerful today than the United States. I'm just saying that wealth and power have been moving towards Asia because China, India, some other countries in Asia have been growing very rapidly economically. And so we're seeing a shift away from the West towards Asia. And that's been underway for some time. We've also seen in recent years a backlash against what you might call hyper-globalization. You see this in the British decision to leave the European Union, Brexit. You see it in the trade wars that the Trump administration has waged, the decoupling of the American and Chinese economies, opposition to immigration and refugees in a number of places around the world. Back, 15 or 20 years ago, people talked about the emergence of a borderless world where trade, investment, migration could all flow more or less seamlessly. Nobody wants to see that anymore. So we're seeing already before the pandemic a backlash against that vision. We also we're seeing increased authoritarianism. According to the think tank Freedom House, which monitors the level of freedom in the world, 2019 was the 13th consecutive year in which the overall level of global freedom declined. And we've seen illiberal trends in a number of different places: Poland, Hungary, Russia, Brazil, Turkey. Even the United States, you could argue, was headed somewhat in that direction, at least until last week. Bottom line here is, even before COVID began, the world was becoming less open, less free, and less dominated by Western powers, and especially the United States. So what are the effects of COVID-19? What have they been? Well, again, most of this will be familiar to you. We now have about 52 million confirmed cases worldwide. I might add, as of yesterday, it was approximately 619,000 in Poland. 1.27 million confirmed deaths, approximately 9,000 in Poland. I read today in the newspaper that the death rate in the United States is now about 1,000 people per day. This, of course, has had enormous economic consequences. The International Monetary Fund is projecting that the world economy will shrink by over 4% in 2020. Poland is doing just slightly better. It's expected to shrink by only 3.6%, but that's still a great hardship for many, many people. And according to the International Labor Organization, in many parts of the world, nearly half of the workforce is at risk of having its livelihood destroyed, not just losing jobs, but having a permanent economic dislocation as a result. To deal with all of these problems, of course, governments have been trying to prop up their economies in various ways, which means many governments are taking on much higher levels of debt than is normally the case. And a rapid economic recovery is unlikely until a vaccine is available. Now, we've gotten some good news in the past week about potential vaccines possibly being both effective and available in a matter of months. I just want to remind everyone that there's a lot of economic damage that has already been done, and a rapid recovery may be difficult because businesses that have gone bankrupt can't simply restart once the pandemic is over. So we may have, in fact, a rather sluggish recovery even when things get back to normal. So what do I see as the main effects? Well, let me start with the first one. I think we're going to see a less open world. COVID-19 revealed another risk to these tightly integrated supply chains that had emerged over the past 20 or 30 years. Highly efficient manufacturing being done in lots of different places, lots of different assemblies happening in many countries all at once, and all of this managed by allowing global trade to move rather seamlessly. It was already clear before COVID that trade wars, like the ones that the Trump administration was conducting, were interfering with that in a variety of ways. And of course, COVID has revealed another risk, that if an economy has to shut down because of a pandemic and you're dependent on manufacturing being done there, that affects all of your businesses. So what we've seen already is states and firms beginning to diversify their supplies, increasing stockpiles, trying to bring more production home so they're not as dependent. And as William Breeder, who is the former chief economist at Citigroup, put it, just-in-time economics will give way to just-in-case economics, with multiple supply chains to ensure continuity in another crisis. This will not be as efficient as the way we had organized the world economy, but it may be more secure in the face of both political, but also in this case, a global health uncertainty. Of course, it's been obvious that COVID-19 made it riskier to travel and Many countries have imposed limitations on who can come to their countries as well. One reason I can't be in Poland is that the European Union is not letting people from the United States enter for all of the obvious reasons. And this has had a dramatic effect. International travel has declined by about 70% in 2020. That's almost entirely due to the impact of the pandemic. But what happens when this is over? Well, I believe there will still be concerns about this kind of problem happening again. The fear of future infections is going to strengthen sort of nationalism, xenophobia, the fear of foreigners. And states afterwards are still going to keep some barriers up to travel and migration. I think when we all start traveling again, going to foreign countries will be more difficult than it used to be. Wouldn't be surprised if there are health checks at borders, if some countries want you to download an app so they can monitor where you're traveling and things like that. And finally, we've all learned that you can do meetings like the one we're having today without having to get on an airplane. And so online exchanges, online lectures, online meetings are going to replace some business travel. It will come back, but my guess is it will not come back to the same level we had 2 or 3 years ago. We're also likely to see a somewhat less free world. In any kind of an emergency, governments always start to limit personal freedoms and civil liberties. Government control inevitably increases. Think of what happens in wartime when you have censorship, when governments take control of the economy, they put restrictions on what people can do in order to deal with the common danger involved in war. Well, COVID-19 has really been no different. We've seen governments order lockdowns where people have to stay in their homes. Some governments putting on increased surveillance of the population, tracking where they're going, ordering mandatory testing, or tracking and tracing arrangements. And that's happened in both dictatorships, but also in some democracies as well. In some countries, such as Hungary, leaders obtained emergency powers to help deal with the pandemic. What I find interesting here is the record for dictatorships and democracies is somewhat mixed. It doesn't appear that being a particular type of government has determined whether you were dealing with the pandemic successfully or not. So there's some obvious success stories among dictatorships like China and North Vietnam. But a number of democracies, New Zealand, Germany, Canada, Australia, South Korea, have also handled the pandemic quite well. Similarly, some democracies, the United States, Great Britain, did not respond well, but some dictatorships, Russia, Iran, Belarus, also did rather poorly as well. So there doesn't seem to be a clear pattern here. My guess is that some restrictions are, of course, going to be lifted once the pandemic is clearly behind us, but probably not all of them, at least in some places, even some restrictions that may have relatively little to do with public health. I might add, this is one place where I've been a little bit wrong. Back last spring, I expected more governments to take advantage of this situation to try and consolidate political control, and that does not seem to have happened in very many places. It's also worth noting that there are some authoritarian leaders that are substantially less popular as a result because they mishandled the pandemic, and that produced popular backlash against them. But I'd say overall, the pandemic is not going to be beneficial to the cause of freedom or democracy. What about the United States itself? Well, the United States still has many advantages. It is still a remarkably resilient, productive, wealthy, and powerful society. But I think perhaps the biggest damage we've suffered is to our reputation for competence. The United States simply did not respond to this particularly well, and that's bad for our overall influence in the world, because having a reputation for knowing what you're doing is one of the ways you can get other states to follow your lead. I am hopeful that that will start to recover with the new administration, but for now it's clearly been harmful to the US reputation, and you can see that in lots of polls that have been taken around the world. Of course, as I mentioned before, the more companies that go out of business, the slower the recovery is once the pandemic is over. You simply can't restart a company if it's gone completely out of business, and that will take a while. In the United States, we've had to close lots of schools. That means students will get this lower educational progress. They will not be as academically advanced, and that's likely to have a long-term effect on our economic productivity. There's also a complication that when you put people in lockdowns and they can't go out as much, you have greater problems with child abuse, greater problems with abuse of spouses, and that's likely to generate long-term mental health issues. You could also make an even more sophisticated argument. It turns out there's some very interesting research suggesting that when pregnant women undergo severe levels of stress, this has very powerful negative effects on the development of the infant as well, and in fact affects their educational achievement long term. Well, COVID-19 has induced an enormous amount of stress on all of us, and people who are bearing children at this time, there may be some long-term consequences there as well. Point I want to emphasize here is that all countries are going to experience these problems to some degree, but the relative impact will be greater the longer the pandemic endures. And that's a problem for countries that weren't able to get it under control, because the impact on them is going to be greater than the impact on some others. So let me shift gears now and talk about what I think this is likely to mean for the world order going forward. As I mentioned at the beginning, nationalism and great power competition were already increasing before the pandemic. You could see this already emerging. And the pandemic hasn't changed that at all. There are lots of incentives, lots of reasons for states to cooperate to try and deal with a problem that is a global problem and that requires, in some respects, a global response. But for the most part, most countries have gone it alone in response to this event. The United States, of course, cut off its funding to the World Health Organization. Russia, China, the United States, and India all declined to contribute to a European initiative, a vaccine research fund. States from China to the United States have sought to protect their own vaccine research efforts. And the United States declined to participate in COVAX, which is a global effort to make vaccines available once we have one developed. And of course, we've seen the United States and China blaming each other for this in a variety of different ways. It's again more evidence that the pandemic is not going to usher in a new era of global cooperation. And meanwhile, even though the world has been dealing with a huge public health event, conflicts have continued to rage in Syria, in Afghanistan, in Yemen, in Ukraine. There's been a border clash between India and China, continued fighting in Sudan. We've seen recent war between Armenia and Azerbaijan as well. So that aspect of world politics hasn't changed either. So what do I anticipate the future global order to be? Well, I think the post-pandemic world will be defined primarily by the rivalry between the United States and China, and especially a rivalry for influence in Asia in particular. These are the two most powerful countries in the world. That's going to be true for many years to come. And in some respects, China's objectives to establish a dominant position in Asia is precisely what the United States is trying to prevent. The United States does not want China to be able to dominate Asia, not conquer Asia, but dominate it politically. And that's going to put the United States and China at odds on a whole series of issues. I believe the European Union will continue to be primarily preoccupied with internal issues, whether it's what's now occurring between Greece and Turkey, the continued efforts to negotiate a trade arrangement with Britain post-Brexit, the budget issues that the EU has faced for a long time, and of course its own challenges in dealing with the economic damage that has been done by COVID. This will, I think, put Europe in a very interesting position vis-a-vis the United States and China. A few weeks ago, the EU Foreign Minister Borrell said that Europe had to chart its own way to avoid being squeezed between the United States and China. I can understand that incentive, but I think Europe will not be able to remain neutral between the United States and China, and at the same time still expect the United States to be fully committed to defending Europe. I believe Europe will have to decide that vis-a-vis China, it is lining up with the United States, or it will be very difficult to persuade Americans to continue to be as committed to European security. In the future world order, Russia will continue to decline relative to other powers. It is, again, not as weak as it was in the 1990s, but this is a country that is not, for the most part, producing advanced technology, not producing cutting-edge products that people want to buy. The Russian economy is shrinking even faster than other parts of the world, now smaller than Italy's, for example. So Russia will be able to play a spoiler role in a number of places, particularly near its own borders. But as I look forward, I see Russia as a less and less significant player in world affairs, not as a more significant player. And as I said at the very beginning, overall power and influence will be shifting in the direction of Asia, which was, of course, happening before the pandemic began. So let me say a little bit about the US-China relationship. This is, as I said, going to define much of world politics. We're going to see military competition in many areas where each side will try to establish powerful positions vis-a-vis the other. China has already worked very hard to try and limit America's ability to project power in Asia. And that effort will continue. Of course, the United States has responded by developing other ways to make sure it can continue to play an important military role with its allies there. There will be a competition for maritime access in East Asia. China has been trying to push the US Navy out in various ways and establish control of areas like the South China Sea. The United States and its partners have been resisting that, and that's going to continue for many years to come as well. There is a continued disagreement over Taiwan. China has declared that it wants to, of course, reunify Taiwan, which it considers to be part of its sovereign territory. The United States has clearly indicated it opposes any effort to incorporate Taiwan back into China that is not voluntary. And right now, Taiwan has no desire to be reincorporated back into China, especially in light of what we've seen happen in Hong Kong in the last several years as well. If the United States does more to help Taiwan defend itself, that is going to be another point of friction between the United States and China. Of course, I think the real area of competition is going to be in advanced technology, 5G internet technology, artificial intelligence, digital standards, a whole series of other issues. And it's worth remembering that the Trump administration and the United States more broadly has basically declared war on certain Chinese industries, most notably Huawei. Both trying to persuade other countries not to use Huawei's 5G technology, and more recently cutting the company off from access to the advanced semiconductor chips that it needs to make many of its products. And this is clearly an effort by the United States to make sure it can retain the technological high ground vis-a-vis China. This is going to be a major area of competition between the two countries, again, for many years to come. And then finally, of course, we'll see a competition for influence in Asia and Africa. The Chinese Belt and Road Initiative was clearly intended to build political influence in a number of different places. The United States has sought to counter that in a number of areas, most particularly in Asia, where we really do want to maintain close ties with allies there. And lastly, we're seeing the two states begin to argue and compete about different notions of human rights, with the United States being very critical of China's policies in Hong Kong, its policies towards the population in Xinjiang, the Uyghur minority as well. And of course, China responding by criticizing what it sees as human rights inadequacies in the United States as well. And I mention this because it shows you that there's going to be something of an ideological dimension to this rivalry as well. It's not simply going to be two great powers with somewhat different geopolitical interests. There's also some fundamental disagreements about core political values, and that will make this competition, I think, even more intense. But even so, the United States and China need to be able to cooperate on some other issues. The most obvious one here is ending the pandemic and preparing for the next one, putting arrangements in place so that the next time some virus jumps from an animal species to humans, it doesn't have the effects that COVID-19 has had. The United States and China have an obvious shared interest in cooperating on climate change. If either one of them refuses to participate, or if they're unable to reach agreements, then this will affect the entire planet, because these are the two largest greenhouse gas emitters. They have a common interest in nuclear security, in making sure that nuclear weapons are never used, and in fact are under very good guardianship, so they can't be stolen, misused inappropriately. And that's, again, an interest that we share with Beijing. It's, I think, widely agreed now that the World Trade Organization is badly in need of reform if we want to maintain the economic benefits of trade with China and others. There's a much needed process of World Trade Organization reform here, and that's going to require the United States and China to be able to compromise and cooperate on the areas within the trading system on which they disagree. I would add just one final point is, developing some rules of the road or norms of conduct to handle the digital world, I think, is going to be increasingly necessary as well. And not just between the United States and China, really between the United States and many other countries. But clearly, if the United States and China do not agree on what sorts of behavior is legitimate or appropriate in cyberspace, that will be another point of friction. And so reaching some loose understandings with Beijing on that topic would be very helpful as well. I mention all this because even in an era where the United States and China are increasingly rivals, there are areas where cooperation is really essential, and preserving those elements of cooperation in an era of rising competition is going to be, I think, the major diplomatic challenge of the post-COVID world. So now let me finally turn to the results of the US election. And I'll say just a few things about this. The first point I would make is it's pretty clear the Biden administration is going to be a very familiar team of experienced officials with rather conventional views on the American role. We're talking about people like, Susan Rice or Michelle Flournoy or William Burns or Jake Sullivan. You could say this is, in some respects, bringing a lot of the Obama team back into office as well. So there's not going to be a lot of surprises, I think, in his appointments. This, as I say, is a group that has rather familiar views. They like America's allies. They are not in favor of unilateral America first policies. They like democracy. They're rather wary of Russia. They have a strong commitment to multilateralism, a strong belief in the need for American leadership. So in that sense, it's going to be a very familiar group. But at the same time, I don't think you're going to see an attempt to sort of turn the clock back completely to what things were in 2016 or even before that. For example, there's just not much interest right now in new wars to the United States or regime change operations, the kinds of things that even the Obama administration did in places like Libya. I think even among this group, there is a newfound skepticism about globalization. They're in favor of international trade. They are not instinctively protectionists, but they don't see all-out globalization, lowering barriers as desirable any longer as well. I think they have no desire to get deeply involved back in the Middle East in particular. So I don't think you're going to see them devoting a lot of time and effort to some of those old Middle East issues like the Israel-Palestine conflict as well. So in that sense, you're not going to see just a replay of the Obama administration. The world, in some respects, has moved on. Third, Biden is going to have to deal with some very serious domestic issues. Obviously, dealing with the pandemic is the first and most important job, because if that doesn't get fixed, lots of other things can't happen. Second, once we get a vaccine, once we're sort of getting back to normal, he's got to work at making sure the US economy recovers as rapidly as possible. And ideally, ending the deep partisan divisions that are dividing the United States would be a wonderful achievement. He has said he wants to do that. It's not at all clear that that's going to be possible or easy, given how polarized the United States has become. And that has one implication, of course. After Trump, other states, including close US friends, have to worry more about American reliability. Even countries that are going to welcome the Biden administration are going to have to ask themselves, is it possible that someone like Trump could get elected again? In other words, having seen the United States swing very far in one direction, it's harder for other states to trust that we won't do that again. Right? And that's going to make it harder for the Biden administration to get other states to compromise with us, because they won't be able to be completely confident that we'll deliver on any pledges that we make. I want to make one final point here. You should also remember that Joe Biden is 77 years old, and there is still a global pandemic going on. He's not going to be getting on Air Force One every month and flying off to a lot of international meetings. Partly because that's not going to be safe, partly because he's got things to do at home, and partly because he's not young. He will have to rely very much on his subordinates, on his Secretary of State, Secretaries of Defense, and others. And my guess is he will be telling them to try to keep foreign policy as quiet as possible while he deals with issues at home. So what do I think he's likely to do? Well, the most obvious thing, and he has already said this, is he'll rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. That's something that's easily done with the stroke of a pen. They will go to great lengths to reassure our allies in Europe that the United States is not leaving NATO, not planning on diminishing its role. But I do think they will continue to press our European allies to take more responsibility for their own defense, because the United States is going to be busy dealing with China in Asia. So that tension, transatlantic disagreement, is going to continue to some degree. There will be a lot of effort devoted to strengthening America's position in Asia, both reassuring our existing allies, but also building deeper ties with others, such as India as well. That's a trend that's been underway for a long time. I expect it to continue under a Biden administration. They will, of course, maintain the competition with China. They're not going to reverse course back to trying to embrace China, and that'll be especially true in the area of advanced technology. In this case, the consensus in the United States has, I think, moved a lot since 2015 or 2016. The big difference with the Biden administration is they will be trying to do this in partnership with lots of other countries. The Trump administration basically tried to take on China on its own, while also picking trade fights with the European Union, Japan, South Korea, and others. I believe the Biden administration will focus very much on the economic competition with China, but try to do that in partnership with most of its allies. If possible, they will try to rejoin the nuclear agreement, the JCPOA, with Iran, but this will not be easy. There's considerable domestic opposition to doing that here in the United States. Iran will be wary of making another agreement with the United States that then might get reversed in the future. There are more sanctions in place now than there were back when the deal was signed. And the deal has less time left to go because it was limited in time. So I think they're interested in seeing if they can return to that, but it may actually be a much more difficult process than you might think. Very importantly, Biden has already pledged, and the people on his team are strongly committed to this, to rebuild the State Department and sort of restore American diplomatic capacity. The overall diplomatic capacity of the United States has withered under Trump, with lots of people leaving the Foreign Service, lots of experienced senior people being sort of demoralized and choosing retirement. I think there'll be a major effort to try and rebuild those capabilities as quickly as possible. And finally, if they are able to, there are several places where we badly need progress towards reaching new multilateral agreements with as many countries as possible. We need new trade arrangements that correspond to the situation the world is in today. We need better agreements on digital architecture. And by that, I mean how we handle big technology companies, how we deal with issues of privacy, where the United States and the European Union, for example, have somewhat different views. What are the technical standards that are required? Whose particular technologies are likely to be used in different places as well. So there's a lot that needs to be negotiated there, and that has been delayed for a long time. Of course, the other lesson of COVID-19 is that we need better arrangements at the global level for dealing with something like a pandemic. So reaching better arrangements with organizations like the World Health Organization would be very valuable as well. And last, but by no means least, progress on climate is probably the single most important long-term objective of any administration. It really needs to be something that all countries are behind. And if the United States is not involved in that, then we're not likely to make much progress. So there's a big foreign policy agenda. The question is, will they be able to get to it? I want to end with one final cautionary warning. I've been saying a little bit about what I thought the Biden administration was going to do in foreign policy. But the thing to remember is that foreign policy is unpredictable. There are almost 200 different countries in the world. All of them have their own interests, and some of them do things that nobody expects from time to time. American presidents often come into office with a set of goals they want to achieve, a to-do list that they intend to implement, and then they find themselves completely surprised by something that happens somewhere in the world. George W. Bush opposed nation building and wanted to focus on great power relations when he became president in 2000. He was completely blindsided by September 11th, and that became the thing that drove his entire foreign policy agenda. Barack Obama did not anticipate the Arab Spring would start while he was president, and he had to spend a remarkable amount of time, effort, and attention wrestling with the implications of the Arab Spring. Donald Trump did not expect there to be a global pandemic while he was president, and whether you think he handled it well or not, the point is that took up a huge amount of his energy and attention in the past year, and it was not something he expected. So the lesson here, or the moral, is that no matter what Biden and his team think they're going to do in foreign policy, events are likely to surprise them, and their responses to those events may surprise us. On that note, I will stop. Thank you very much for your attention, and look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Professor. Well, with your last point, you are not making our task, you seem easy. I obviously have in mind our thinking and our forecast we can make here and with regard to the international development. But before we move, the picture is rather dark, the picture is rather gloomy, but at least it is comprehensive and well structured, and I guess that some points, we will need some time to digest some of your points. But before we move to the main lines of your lecture, there's plenty of questions I see, and I will refer to them immediately after the one which I want to ask you before. As I said, we move to the main lines, your points of your introductory note. Do you, Professor Walt, do you assume in your thinking about the near future developments in the political development in the United States, do you take into account the possibility that Donald Trump will never concede his defeat, even in December, in January, and he will refuse to cooperate in the transition procedure in the White House and in the administration? So what then, if so? Because it seems up to now that he's not serious, he's not at all taking into account the possibility of giving up. So I don't know whether you or your colleagues are at all you see taking into account that he will never concede, and rather, like many African leaders, they fail in the election, but they stay in power, and there is no way to to remove them. So, I mean, is this scenario in your thinking somehow present or not?
Well, certainly the president's refusal to concede the election is worrisome. I do not think it is very likely that come January, when it is time to inaugurate the new president, that he is going to be able to stay in the White House, lock the door and refuse to leave. I don't think that's a reasonable option. A couple of points. The last time we were in a situation a little bit like this was, of course, the year 2000, when there was a very tightly contested election and it took a while to resolve. That came down to 500 votes in Florida, which is why it was so close and why there was then this long recount. Biden's lead on Trump in all of the states that are somewhat close is thousands of votes, in some cases tens of thousands of votes. So this is not a particularly close election in any of the states that are slightly contested, nothing like what we saw in year 2000. The Trump administration has already filed suit in a number of cases, a number of states protesting the election results. And these cases are all being dismissed very quickly because there's no evidence to support the claims they are making. So his attempt to do this in the court system is failing. It's also worth noting that many Republican election officials in different states have been certifying that the elections were done freely, they were done fair, there was no fraud involved. So the claim that this is somehow fraudulent, I think, is just not standing up to it. That said, so I think that we will have a transition and the Biden administration will take power. But there are two problems here. First of all, by refusing to concede defeat, recognize the results of the process, and refusing to cooperate with the new team, it's going to make a harder transition for Biden. That they're not able to get prepared, they're not able to talk with their counterparts, they won't be able to be told exactly what the situation is on a variety of different policy issues, sort of until they actually move into their offices. And I wouldn't be completely surprised to see some people in the Trump administration go try to make this as difficult as possible. And of course, this is a terrible result because it makes it harder for the Biden administration to do whatever they wish to do for the sake of the country. This has never happened before in an American presidential transition. When Obama left the White House and Trump replaced him, the Obama administration cooperated fully with the Trump administration to make that transition happen. That was true when the Bush administration left and the Obama administration took over. That has always been the case, even after very bitterly fought elections. And interfering with a smooth transition process is not good for any area of policy, and it's certainly not good for the American image in the world as a mature democracy that knows what it's doing. The second reason why the president's behavior is worrisome is that it is simply going to reinforce the deep political divisions that already exist in the United States. So by declaring that the results aren't legitimate, the president is basically signaling some of his supporters that they should not treat Joe Biden as the next president, that he's not a legitimate president. And that's going to reinforce their unwillingness to cooperate. This is terrible for the United States. This is a disaster for the United States because there are a whole series of issues where we need to be able to act. We need to be able to act on COVID. We need to be able to act to keep the economy going. We need to be able to do a variety of things to improve America's infrastructure in order to compete effectively with other countries, including China. In other words, we need to be united as a country. And what the president is now doing is trying to ensure that we remain as divided as possible. So I think this is deeply harmful, even though I don't think it will affect the outcome of the election. I don't think there's any realistic chance by which he is able to remain in office, given that the election turned out the way it did.
Thank you very much for your comment on the prospects, the scenario which seems to me well terrific. But okay, fine. Thank you for that. There are many questions, and the first question comes from Professor Patrycja Grzewik. Mrs. Patrycja refers to your assumption, to your forecast on the growing competition between China and the United States in Africa, while Patrycja, she thinks that what we see is a kind of spontaneous maybe division of labor between China and the United States. United States taking care of Middle East while leaving at the same time free field for China expansion in Africa. How would you comment on that?
That's a very interesting idea, and I think that there's maybe been some evidence of that over the past 20 or 25 years or so, where the United States has been very focused on the Middle East, really ever since September 11th. And that has, I think, given China the opportunity to expand its influence in some other areas, in a sense, while the United States was not paying as close attention. The one place, of course, where the United States has been very involved in Africa has been in counter-terror operations. So we've had a very extensive military role in Africa. We have not been doing as much as China to foster economic development, and I think in some senses build political ties that way. The other point I'd make, though, is many people, and I would put myself in this group, believe that American involvement in the Middle East for the past 25 years has been a disaster. In other words, this division of labor has not worked out well from the United States' point of view. It's been very beneficial for China. I mean, if you think of the amount of money that the United States spent, some $6 trillion total on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, from a Chinese point of view, this was wonderful. The United States gets involved in a very costly series of conflicts from which it gets essentially no benefits whatsoever, and it doesn't cost China anything. So I think, I'm hopeful that the Biden administration does not want to continue a division of labor where China builds close political ties and profitable economic relations in Africa, while the United States continues to try and run the Middle East and doesn't do a very good job of that. One final point is, I think it's very important not to exaggerate the effectiveness of Chinese economic diplomacy. I think one thing we are learning about the Belt and Road Initiative is it has not always had a positive effects even for China. That some of the countries that they have tried to build influence in have resented the terms of the arrangements. Other countries are becoming warier of, borrowing a lot of money from China, because if you get indebted, then suddenly the Chinese have lots of leverage on them. So even there, one shouldn't exaggerate just how successful that effort has been. I think it has been substantially more successful than American efforts in the Middle East, but that's not saying much.
Thank you very much. And now the question from Professor Marek Madej. By the way, Marek Madej edited recently a great book on the Western wars. Well, the wars of the Western military interventions after Cold War. I'm sure that in many points you would agree, or you would share your assessment concerning Western military interventions after Cold War. So Marek Madej is asking you whether you see any impact of COVID pandemia on the functioning of the Atlantic Alliance, and they're taking into account also the question of border sharing, which is spoiling the mood within the Atlantic Alliance. I would even go further, and I would enlarge Marek's question into the economic area. Would you believe that the two sides might come back to the so-called economic NATO, TTIP in another, I would say, version, or it is absolutely over, and both sides of the Atlantic Ocean will never come back to this concept? So I like a double question in one. Sorry.
Yeah, I do not think the pandemic per se is having much of an impact on transatlantic relations. Maybe at the margin, it's certainly distracting people in Europe and people in the United States. So you get less attention being paid to managing transatlantic relations. But the debates over just what the relationship between the United States and Europe should be going forward do not revolve, it seems to me, very much around pandemic responses. It has to do with, your view of Russia, your view of the value of NATO, the issues that we disagree upon, such as burden sharing, etc. You add COVID to that, it doesn't change that debate very much. And as I said, I think the Biden team very much believes in the Atlantic Alliance. It's a very transatlantic oriented group, but that doesn't mean those disagreements, those areas of tension won't continue. And as I said, I don't think it is going to be possible to sustain a very close transatlantic partnership if European countries at the same time want to be equally close to China. I think that in the sense that if Europe wants to be neutral, that's fine. That may even be in Europe's interest. But at that point, the United States would no longer feel like it wanted to be fully committed to European security. And I don't think the pandemic really is going to affect those calculations very much. I don't see a return to something like TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, anytime soon. I mean, first of all, the EU and Great Britain are going to have to work out what their relationship is. And it's hard to imagine doing something like TTIP when we still don't know exactly what the trade relationship between Britain and the continent's going to be. Maybe that'll be settled by the end of the year, maybe not. But secondly, as I indicated in my remarks, I think support for these enormous, elaborate multilateral trade agreements has gone down considerably in the United States, in part because the economic effects of them have been seen as politically controversial, politically damaging. There's not as much support for them in the Republican Party as there used to be, and there's not as much support in the Democratic Party, where there's always been a certain amount of wariness. I think there may be an effort made to revise or update the World Trade Organization, but I can't imagine the Biden administration devoting a lot of effort in the first year or two to resurrecting something like TTIP. They may try to resurrect the Trans-Pacific Partnership in some form, right? You recall that when the Trump administration took us out of TPP, the other members in Asia proceeded with their own version of it, which the United States is not part of. The Biden administration may at least explore affiliating itself with that, not so much for economic reasons, but for strategic reasons, to tie itself and to tie those countries more closely to the United States politically and strategically, which was part of the rationale for the Trans-Pacific Partnership in the first place. I'm not sure they're going to be able to do that, however. I think that if the Democrats don't control the Senate, I think the ability to get something like a big trade agreement through is going to be very, very limited. And so, whether it's a TTIP or TPP or something like that, I don't see it happening unless the Democrats get control of the Senate, and maybe not even then.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Professor. I fully agree with you on the supposed luxury of the European position vis-a-vis China. I mean, that Europe could keep, equal distance from US and in China vis-a-vis emerging bipolarism in the world order, in the world affairs. However, up to now, there was no way to align with the United States as long as Trump is in the White House. He simply, to cooperate with him, it was it was absolutely impossible on anything, including common position vis-a-vis China. But maybe with the new administration, it would be easier to find a common ground and to shape, let's say, common strategy, soft strategy vis-a-vis, because I have no doubt the role of Europe is on the American side and not looking for, as I said, luxury of the equidistant position.
Yeah, and let me add one other point to that reinforces that position. I mean, you could make the argument 20 or 25 years ago that the United States was in such a powerful position, it really didn't need allies very much. China was still much weaker. Russia was flat on its back. You know, the United States could sort of ignore its allies a lot of the time and do whatever it wanted. And that's exactly what we did, a period of real unilateralism. What was very interesting about the Trump administration, and I think one of the places they got things badly wrong, is they were right that we had to start taking China more seriously as a rival. And at the same time, they wanted to pick fights with almost everyone and try to take on China all by ourselves, right? And that makes no sense at all, right? If you think about China, this is a country that now has an economy as large as ours, has 3 or 4 times the population, doesn't have the same problems of political division, at least right now, as well, and has been moving very rapidly. If you're dealing with a rival like that, you need lots of national unity at home, and you need as much help as you can get from other powerful countries, other powerful, wealthy, sophisticated countries. You want help from Japan, you want help from South Korea, you want help from Australia, you want help from India, you want help from Europe, right? And this is something I think the Trump administration never fully appreciated, which was the importance of using our alliances for what is now the major strategic challenge we face.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. Now, there is a question from Professor Stephenem Waltem, which relates to what you said about the shift of power and wealth from the west to the east as the consequence of the pandemia. And the question is whether it is absolutely sure that the very fact that China did manage better than the US with pandemia will increase or is going to offer an advantage to China vis-a-vis the United States. Also taking into account that it is, after all, Chinese responsibility to first to generate and to send to the rest of the world of COVID-19. I mean, are you absolutely sure about your point on the increase of the role of et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah. Well, I think there's 2 things there. One has to think of the long-term trend here and then the short-term effects of the pandemic. The long-term trend is that China has come back after 200 years of weakness, that the problems of the Chinese political system, the fact that they didn't modernize the way the rest of the world did for 150 years, made a country that had previously been much more powerful quite weak and quite vulnerable to various forms of Western interference. Then when China regains its independence under Mao, they have this completely crazy economic system, so that in 1975, the per capita income in China was only about $150 a year, right? So China was this enormous potential power that for 150 or 170 years had never been very capable, never been very significant as well. Well, once they threw out Marxism, Leninism, and adopted essentially a capitalist form of development, they've taken off, right? And now they're quite a significant player. And that was going to happen as soon as they abandoned all of the crazy economic practices they had followed, under Mao. And there was nothing much the rest of the world could do to stop that, right? We would not have been able to prevent China from developing once they started following smarter policies as well. So there's a long-term trend here that has made the overall, distribution of the world economy shift towards Asia. And something like that, by the way, is also happening in India, but at a much slower pace. Now, as for the pandemic, I mean, I think that the fact that China was the original source of this hurt its image to some degree. People blamed the Chinese government with some validity for mishandling this in a way that made it escape China. They didn't tell the rest of the world about it fast enough, and that's one of the reasons we have this problem. However, since then, the fact that they appear to have gotten it under control does make their system look better. And more importantly, by getting it under control, it allows their economy to start reopening and start up again in ways that we can't do yet in the United States, that most countries in Europe can't do yet. Now, China has still taken a hit, right? Its economic growth rate is much lower than it has been. And of course, they can restart their economy, but if the rest of the world isn't restarted, they don't have as many countries to trade with, right? So it's still going to be a problem for them, but that's another advantage that they have just by getting it under control. Their economic recovery begins before ours does. The one thing that I think has really hurt the Chinese in this is this would have been an opportunity for China to adopt a much more open, friendly, supportive attitude towards the rest of the world. And instead, what the Chinese have done in recent years, sometimes referred to as wolf warrior diplomacy, this very aggressive, hard-nosed, coercive, sometimes almost insulting approach to dealing with other governments. And this has produced an enormous backlash. So, you know, when you think about it, there's this moment where the United States is being run by Donald Trump, and Donald Trump is managing to insult people all over the world, and to no good purpose. And it has approval ratings in other countries, including countries that like the United States in general, is incredibly low, historically low. This is an enormous opportunity for Beijing to go make friends in all the places where the Trump administration was offending people. And they missed the opportunity because they reacted by being, in a sense, more aggressive, more assertive in ways that angered many of the people they were dealing with. So, you know, yes, the COVID-19, I think, ultimately has made their system look better than ours, at least temporarily. But I believe China has squandered some of the political or diplomatic opportunities that they might have had.
Thank you very much. And now Dr. Andrzej Deczyński, our friend from University of Wrocław, huge city on the border with Germany, western part of Poland. Well, he's asking, or he makes the following remark. Don't you think that paradoxically pandemia may reverse the trend of increasing dependency of the West because of the growing result of awareness and growing awareness on the negative consequences of a global supply chain. So at the end, this is something which may serve the West the way we understand. I mean, whether you share this point or not. What's your opinion?
Yeah, I think that's right, and I indicated that at one point. So this is something that was already happening before COVID happened. It was referred to by some as decoupling. That as the United States and China were becoming more competitive, or the relations were deteriorating, there was starting to be pressure on various firms to reduce their involvement in China, not be entirely dependent upon getting goods from China. So what had been happening for 30 years, as I mentioned, was the development of these very elaborate supply chains where business firms would go out and try to find the cheapest place they could get something they needed to put in whatever they were going to make. And who can make it cheaply? And what they were discovering is that if suddenly the US government said, well, you can't trade with that firm anymore, we're going to put a tariff on goods from China, suddenly the cost of that component that you're getting from China because it's cheaper there goes way up, and that affects your ability to make money. And maybe as a smart business decision, you shouldn't be entirely dependent upon getting goods, getting things manufactured, getting your iPhone assembled, in China. Maybe you should diversify. And that's what we're seeing happening as the relationship between the United States and China deteriorates. What that means is that things will cost a little more because it won't be quite as efficient as going to the very cheapest supplier. But it also means that the risk of supply disruptions is going to go down because you're going to be able to get parts from a number of different places, and to some degree there'll be more manufacturing done at home. There's one final thing is I actually believe we will also see the concentration of trade relations in a more bipolar fashion. So, 30 years from now, US trade relations are going to be more with countries that we are politically aligned with and less with countries that we are politically competitive with than they are today. That doesn't mean the United States and China will have no economic dealings whatsoever. We will continue to trade and invest in a variety of ways, but I think that's going to go down. And our trade relations with countries we consider to be sort of reliable friends are likely to go up. And that may be true with China as well, where they will have a set of countries that they have, sort of close political, economic relations as well. In a sense, I'm suggesting the world begins to split into two spheres again, a US sphere and a Chinese-led sphere. And exactly who's in those two spheres remains to be seen.
Thank you, Professor. And there is a question from Dr. Yogesh Borse on India. What may be the role of India as the consequence of the changes you were talking about as the direct outcome of pandemia, COVID-19 pandemia, or in more general sense, because the world order is changing anyway, pandemia is only accelerating some shift. Do you see something specific as to India as a permanent member of the security arrangement which may emerge? What you're thinking about?
Yeah, well, there's no question that the United States and India have been moving closer together strategically for at least 20 years. This really begins at the very end of the Clinton administration. It was then pursued quite energetically by the Bush administration and continued by Obama and indeed under Trump. And I think this is, for lack of a better term, this is balance of power politics or balance of threat politics working. What's pushing the United States and India closer together is that they're both concerned about the growing power of China. That said, we are not formal allies with India. We have been encouraging the emergence of the so-called Quad in Asia, close ties between India, Australia, Japan, and the United States as well. But there are some limits to this. First, that India has its own political divisions, and although India's economic growth has improved in recent years, it hasn't come anywhere close to Chinese levels of economic growth for reasons that are largely due to the character of Indian politics. India has had a very tough time with the pandemic, as one might expect, given the sort of state of the public health infrastructure in India as well. So yes, the United States and India are moving closer together, but how valuable an ally India will ultimately be, given that its economy is still much weaker than China's, its military is substantially weaker than China's, I think that remains to be seen. People have been disappointed, I think, for a long time that India has not moved up faster. I think that's true to some degree. Indians are disappointed, but also those who would like to have a closer U.S.-Indian relationship.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Another question coming from Dr. Łukasz Golota on long-term American approach towards China, because last long-term approach, so change via liberalization and globalization failed. It was the China who was the winner of the past approach, and then the 4 years of this hectic, very chaotic policy by Donald Trump. And so, do we have a choice between previous one? I mean, serious rational thought between the previous one, which failed, and tough containment, or something similar to what would be the American, or long-term proposal or vision how to shape the relations with China?
Yeah. Well, I think the primary American goal will be twofold. The first one will be to make sure that China is not able to establish a dominant position in a number of key industries, and things like artificial intelligence and other things, particularly things that might have military applications. The United States, in some respects, succeeded in the Cold War because its economy was always stronger than that of the former Soviet Union, and a key part of that was American technology was superior. And that had lots of military benefits to it. It also meant that other countries were more interested in having close economic ties with us as well. So particularly in areas of technology, you're going to see the United States do whatever it can to compete. And the Trump administration did that. As I said, by declaring war on Huawei, that was essentially an economic and technological competition as well. So that's objective number one. The second objective will be to make sure that the United States remains in close strategic partnerships with most Asian countries. The United States does not want China to be in a position to dominate East Asia so much so that it no longer has to worry about sort of its immediate surroundings. Right now, China worries a lot about its relations with Japan and Korea and others in Asia, and is less able to project power and influence into other parts of the world because it has to worry a lot about things closer to home. The United States, I think, would like that to continue. Keep China sort of having to worry about local politics so that it cannot easily interfere in the Middle East, cannot easily interfere even in the Western Hemisphere, close to the United States. And that means maintaining a set of close alliance relationships, which is not going to be easy to do and is going to require a lot of diplomatic attention. And this, by the way, gets us back to the question of the transatlantic relationship, because there are only 7 days in a week and 24 hours in a day. And that means top American officials, if they have to spend a lot more time talking to people in Asia, are going to have less time to spend coming to Brussels, coming to Warsaw, coming to Paris, going to Berlin, etc. It's not that they're going to pay no attention at all to Europe, but in a sense, I think Europeans have to recognize that it's not the Cold War any longer. Europe is not going to necessarily be the centerpiece of a lot of what happens. And so if Joe Biden says that his first foreign trip is not going to be to Europe, but his first foreign trip is going to be to, say, Australia, Seoul, and Tokyo, don't assume that that means we don't care about Europe. It just means that China is not located in Europe. So I think that it's going to be partly, again, competition in high technology and competition for influence and in particular, the maintenance of alliance relationships in Asia.
Thank you very much. Let us switch for a brief while to the country you mentioned, to the power you mentioned, but very briefly. Talking about Russia, you said first on the, let's say, increasing international role, and then a few lines later on the decreasing power or potential of Russia, and Russia as a rather spoiler in international relations. And then what future for a Russian international role you foresee? Is Russia continued? I mean, let's continue to play a spoiler. I mean, I guess under Putin is nothing serious. And I mean, no serious change may happen, it seems to me. But then, do you have any thought on the future international role of Russia? Either it will continue like that, or something may change.
Well, I think the United States has badly mishandled its relationship with Russia, and Russia has badly mishandled its relationship with the United States. And we were all more optimistic back in the 1990s that it was going to be a fundamentally different relationship. As you probably know, I was not a fan of NATO enlargement. I do think because I felt it was going to poison the relationship with Russia, and I think it did do that. I think one might have been able to do the first wave of NATO enlargement, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, and then one needed to stop. One could not go beyond that without essentially guaranteeing that you were going to have a negative relationship with Russia. I mean, I think here's the problem. Russian behavior in a whole variety of ways, Ukraine most obviously, but lots of others, is deeply objectionable and something that is of obvious concern to the United States and obvious concern to European countries as well. At the same time, it would be good if we could pull Russia away from China, if we could give it more incentives to have a more distant relationship with China. And in a sense, it would be good for Europe if Russia were no longer interfering in Ukraine. It would be good for Russia if the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia were lifted. And it would be good for the United States if we could start to drive a wedge between Moscow and Beijing. The question is, how do you do that? Right. And that, I think, is not at all easy to do at this point. I think it was impossible for the Trump administration to do that, even if they had wanted to, because there were so many questions about Trump's relationship with Russia, his relationship with Putin. He couldn't move in that direction. I think a Biden administration actually could, and but they would have to do it very carefully. And the place they will probably start is by trying to resurrect or continue some of the arms control agreements, renew the New START treaty, which is something Russia has asked for. It's in our interest to do that, at least in the short term. And that might be a sort of first step to sort of asking, well, are there other places we can start to unwind the particularly conflictive relationship we have with Russia today? Whether or not it's going to have to wait until there's a different, president in Russia remains to be seen. But I think it's unfortunate for sort of all parties concerned, for the Russians, for the Europeans, and for us, that we've managed to get into such a deeply suspicious and poisonous relationship.
Thank you, Professor. Ladies and gentlemen, we agreed on 90 minutes, and we have to keep to our timetable. And let us, however, Professor, to ask you, because there is a unique chance we have, you see, just two brief questions that I selected out of a number of others that you can imagine. Maybe they can be answered relatively quickly. First is, what would be the American position policy toward the Middle East? Is it going to, to come back to the traditional democratic line like Obama or Clinton, or the Biden might keep something what was taken on board by the present administration? And the outgoing. And the second question, if there is anything you value, you appreciate in the foreign policy of the outgoing administration, of maybe something positive which he himself, Trump or his administration, brought into the program of American foreign policy. These are the last two questions, and I'm really happy that Professor Stephenem Waltem is strong enough to face them at a good pace, dynamic, and incredibly interesting. Please, Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, so with respect to the Middle East, I believe that the Biden administration will want to minimize American direct involvement there. They're not going to disengage from the Middle East entirely, but they I think he would like to get out of Afghanistan and will do so. I think that would happen, by the way, in a second Trump administration as well. They will not give our friends in the Middle East the same blank check that the Trump administration did. I mean, basically, Trump has said, you know, Israel, you can do whatever you want. Saudi Arabia, you can do whatever you want. Gulf states, you can do whatever you want. Egypt, you can do whatever you want. And the Biden administration will be a little tougher on all of those countries, but not a lot tougher. We're not going to suddenly start putting enormous pressure on any of those countries to change their policies, with the one possible exception of the Saudi war in Yemen. I could imagine a Biden administration trying to end American involvement, maybe curtailing arms sales and things like that. But that's about as far as I could see them going as well. I think they understand that there is simply not very much for the United States to gain right now by being deeply involved in the Middle East, and so they're going to try to minimize the American role. So what did Donald Trump get right? He got two things right. He was correct in pointing out that Europeans were still overly dependent on American protection, and that they were not, pulling their weight within the alliance. That doesn't make him unique, however, because Barack Obama said that, George W. Bush said that, Bill Clinton said that, and every American president all the way back to Dwight Eisenhower has been worried that Europeans were too dependent. The problem with Trump is he had no effective way of actually getting progress on that, and he kept making enemies where he didn't need to. The second thing he got right, again, not unique to him, but he was correct that the United States really needed to take China more seriously as an economic rival, that it was time to, in a sense, get tough with China on a whole series of trade and technology issues. I do not think they pursued that goal very effectively. And as a result, the attempts largely haven't accomplished their purposes. But he understood that that was an important issue that we had to address. The third one, by the way, is he was correct that we should try something new with North Korea. What he chose to do didn't work very well because there was no strategy. He thought he could sort of go in and charm Kim Jong-un and get him to give up his nuclear arsenal by promising him a lot of economic development. And I think nobody who understands North Korea thought that was very likely. But it wasn't, given where we were with North Korea, maybe making the attempt wasn't so terrible. And a Biden administration should be open to renewing diplomatic engagement with North Korea in the hopes of at least creating a more stable situation there. So in many respects, Trump had actually not terrible instincts on foreign policy, but his personal character deficiencies and his inability to assemble an effective team and a coherent strategy for achieving his goals, I think, doomed him to repeated foreign policy failures.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you. It's been an enormous pleasure, obviously, to have you here, to listen to you, to see you directly from Harvard University. I have no words to thank you, how much we value your lecture and then the discussion with us. Obviously, I thank you all participants, our audience, for sending great questions. You could, Professor, refer to them, and I can only hope, I can only pray to see you as soon as possible in person at our place, the University of Warsaw Department of Political Science and International Studies. And let us hope that the time we will see you here is not very distant. If the pandemic is over during the next few months, I hope to see you in 2021, obviously in Warsaw. So thank you very much again.
It was my pleasure. I will look forward to my first visit to Warsaw, and I hope it is soon. Thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Stephen.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Giants.